I've come to kill you.
I have the blood of Magnus in me.
Magnus burned.
I have the blood of Akasha in me.
Hello my beautiful watchers, and welcome to Lost in Adaptation, the YouTube review show dedicated to comparing media to the books it's based on. Last month we took a look at Season 1 of AMC's Interview with the Vampire. If you missed it, there's the thing, but the TLDR is I deemed it a radically unfaithful but intellectually engaged and respectful adaptation of Anne Rice's novel. A show that wasn't trying to recreate the original story in any level of detail, but was trying to preserve its spirit while also interrogating it, modernizing its messages, and occasionally weaponizing its audience's expectations based on having read the book against them, but in a good way. In my opinion, the only disappointing side effect was, because they chose to make the story a lot more focused on the emotional and romantic drama of the leads, it robbed the vampires of the unique otherworldliness of Anne Rice's creations, which was a major draw of the novel for me. And now, partly because I didn't have time to read a whole new book over Christmas, we're gonna see if Part 2 followed suit. Originally premiering in 2024, the second season had only one notable change in cast, as Claudia actress Bailey Bass was too busy on Pandora to return and was replaced with Delaney Hales. It was met with pretty much the same positive reaction from Anne Rice fans as Season 1, so let's look if that was because it was more in keeping with her work, or simply really fucking good on its own merits, like Season 1. Like with the first season, despite the show being a reimagining from the ground up, it still hit a surprising amount of major plot beats from the novel. Louis and Claudia travelling across Europe in search of other vampires, eventually ending up in Paris where they're approached by a coven led by a young-looking vampire called Armand. The coven living and working in a theatre where they openly live as vampires and regularly kill on stage in front of a crowd of humans under the guise of it being a gothic play. The leading man, Santiago, a vampire with a surprising amount of extra powers, taking a dislike to Louis. At Claudia's behest, Louis turns a woman named Madeline into a vampire to be her companion in the event of them parting ways. The vampire acting troupe discovering that Claudia broke some ancient vampire rules, including trying to kill Lestat, who makes a miraculous reappearance and being executed along with Madeline via sunlight. Louis getting buried alive in a coffin until Armand rescues him, and avenging Claudia by burning the theatre to the ground and decapitating anyone who makes it out of their flaming coffins. Louis and Armand travelling the world together, but eventually breaking up and going their separate ways. Louis randomly coming across Lestat, who's existing in a weakened state, being attended by new fledglings that don't like him very much. This one's actually a little complicated because it is indeed true to this book, but it's one of the things that Rice retcons by claiming that Louis made it up to make himself seem cooler than Lestat. The Frenchie was hibernating underground in the decade that Louis claimed this interaction took place. However, said extended nap apparently happened more than a century ahead of schedule in this version of the story, so fuck it, they can do whatever the fuck they want here, I guess. Because the show is, on the whole, still doing its own thing, I was once again surprised to see the occasional loyalty to the book that surpassed the otherwise much more accurate 1994 movie. For example, the zombie-like animalistic vampires they found in Europe and ended up having to destroy in self-defense. They fudged a lot of the details around them, but it was still interesting to see them included in any capacity. Though it is a shame they didn't include the amusing twist that, because Louis and Claudia would usually put the creatures out of their misery, they gained a very ironic reputation as heroic vampire hunters in the local area. And just before moving on, I want to take a second to thank my amazing patrons for making Lost in Adaptation possible, including but not limited to Shelby Holtz, Beloved Self-Fiend, and Gelly Elfson. So I mentioned that the reveal that the creepy little guy who'd been hanging around the entire time throughout Season 1 was the vampire Armand, and that he was still in a relationship with Louis at the time of the interview had a lot of implications for the story. Well, the main reason for this is in the novel, while Louis and Armand did travel together for an unspecified and possibly significant amount of time after Claudia's death, they broke up and parted ways long before Louis met Daniel, possibly before he was even born. Them still being together 77 years later pretty much guaranteed that Season 2 wasn't planning to stay on the rails any longer than Season 1 did. This version of Armand followed the same philosophy the show adhered to with most things, i.e. doing its own thing, but doing it in a way that maintained a surprising amount of the book's original spirit. They took Armand's outwardly gentle presentation that belies a deeply manipulative and deceptive nature from the book and applied it to the more overtly romantic nature of vampire relationships in the show. Put bluntly, Armand is not just a Machiavellian planner when it comes to vampire politics now, he's also an abusive partner who gaslights and controls Louis using both conventional and supernatural methods to dictate everything he does, says, or even remembers. Related, the show is extremely clever in how it recontextualizes things established in the first season, like Louis' oddly flat and unemotional cadence in the modern framing device, that contrasted so strongly with his Creole accent in the flashback scenes. It's easy to assume at first that it's simply the result of a slow shift over his extremely long life, but Season 2 slowly makes it clear it's a side effect of Armand's long-term suppression of his emotions and trauma, and his accent starts to creep back in immediately after their breakup, signifying the start of Louis' return to himself. The interview framing device, already a much bigger part in the show than it ever was in the book, is now almost as significant in the plot as the story being told in it, as Daniel attempts to work around Armand's interference in the interview and works together with Louis to piece together what Armand is hiding from them. This culminates in Daniel revealing Armand's lies to Louis and prompts him to finally throw off the older vampire's control over him. What's very funny about this is, in the book, Louis and Armand's relationship just kind of fizzled out due to a lack of passion. There wasn't some big plot twist or epic fight, despite Armand's attempts to instigate one. Louis, there's something I have to confess to you. It was I who ordered Claudia's death. I orchestrated the entire thing. Yeah, I know. What do you mean you know? It's kind of obvious. And you're not upset about it? Eh. Louis, is there anything I can do for you? Anything you need? I'm good. Oh shit, he's not coming back. It was a sad irony kind of thing. Armand was trying to get Louis as a companion because he was the only vampire he'd met in centuries who felt strong emotions about things, which he was desperate to hold on to because every other vampire around him was succumbing to apathy and eventually descending into madness. Even Louis' intensely negative emotions were a step up from that. But by killing Claudia and getting what he wanted, he'd caused Louis to go completely numb inside, destroying the very thing he wanted him for. Admitting to killing Claudia was his last attempt to get a rise out of Louis before giving up and facing the reality that he had let his entire coven get wiped out for nothing. It's always slightly awkward when a relationship that was very clearly parent and child originally becomes more romantic in the adaptation. Madeline was originally a woman who lost her daughter and saw Claudia as a child who would never die on her the same way, and although Claudia was mentally an adult, she was still aware that she needed a parent figure in her life so she could function in society. The lost child backstory is downgraded to Little Sister. Still tragic, but not as relevant to her psychological state. Madeline's vibe with Claudia is now overtly flirtatious and potentially romantic.
Is it romantic?
No, not yet.
The issue that I touched on in Season 1, that the show was trying to have its cake and eat it regarding Claudia having been aged up so considerably, but still wanting to maintain the story arc about her suffering the curse of eternal infancy, is noticeably more pronounced in this season. Everyone keeps acting as if she looks like a child and has to deal with the social restrictions of presenting as a child, but that just isn't reflected in the events of the show. She's still able to travel unaccompanied without raising concerns from passers-by and form romantic connections with other adults. They sort of try to compensate at one point by having Lestat go on a rant about how terrible it will be for her to be in puberty forever, but that's just a very different thing to being treated as an infant for eternity, and raises a ton of questions about hormone imbalances carrying over into vampirism. And I hate to say it because Delaney Hales gave an extremely good performance, but the casting choice exacerbated this issue. Hales was 26 at the time of recording, and I can't be the only person who thinks that she looks 26. I absolutely get that casting someone over 18 saves a massive amount of trouble regarding child labor laws, but she's 12 years older than the character she's playing, and and 21 years older than the character these plot points were originally designed for. This part of the story was written for a 5-year-old, it's only been partially updated for a 14-year-old, and it's being portrayed by a 26-year-old. If we're supposed to be suspending our disbelief and imagining that she looks super young, then that kind of recontextualizes all the scenes of Madeline flirting with her if she was also perceiving her as a 14-year-old girl. Part of Madeline's new backstory involved being perpetually punished for sleeping with a German soldier, but apparently no one had an issue with her traipsing around Paris with what would appear to be a child bride. New Louis eventually coming to see his vampire unlife as a gift worth thanking Lestat for instead of an eternal curse, and being willing to create another vampire without extreme coercion cuts the last thread binding him to Louis of the book. Perpetual depression is the basis of his entire character. He is literally the personification of the author's grief over the death of her daughter. As alluded to earlier, while zombie vampires were present in the novel, their origin is somewhat different. In the show, they appear to be the product of an insufficiently powerful vampire attempting to create fledglings. It's not explicitly confirmed in the book, but Louis and Claudia's working theory is they were vampires who were buried underground by people who thought they were dead and went mad with hunger before they could dig their way out. The flashback to the interview in the 1970s was pretty word for word accurate for about 2 minutes, then they started doing this repressed memory conspiracy thing. Louis appears to be a little put off at first by the morbid sadism of the Parisian coven toying with their prey on stage and making art pieces out of their murders. This continues the previous season's trend of making him the token voice of morality, which is a simplification of his character in the book. Book Louis is, for want of a more elegant description, kind of a pretentious wanker, and it's increasingly obvious with every subsequent novel that he's causing a lot of his own misery and self-loathing, by choice. He's constantly feeling sorry for himself because of the dark existence he leads as a vampire, forced to take life to sustain his own, but as soon as the series has a more reliable narrator, you learn that he's actually being unnecessarily evil even by vampire standards. Every other powerful vampire has a more stringent moral code regarding who they feed on than him. Freaking Akasha calls him out for it. Yeah, the queen of vampires is like, damn dude, you're such an asshole. So yeah, Book Louis is indeed more aware of the despicable nature of vampire existence than most, and he does worse than all of them anyway. Once again, the show plays up the vampires being hypersexual beings, in stark contrast to the unspoken but very clear asexuality of Anne Rice's original Creatures of the Night. Something I really should have mentioned in the previous episode is, while making the show overtly, openly gay and unapologetically unafraid to show rampant queer sexuality on screen in 4K is great representation for the L's, G's and B's, asexuality is arguably even more underrepresented on the whole, and Anne Rice's vampires were one of the few famous exceptions. By making the vampires fuck like they have an orgasm quota, it robs the aces of this rare representation. As a straight cis male, there are obvious limitations on the appropriateness of my commenting on this, but it seems like a no easy right answer scenario. Queer representation is so often a finite resource these days, so there's bound to be some custody battles over it. Louis, being black now and dealing with the intense racism of early 20th century New Orleans, was a massive part of season 1. It was, in my admittedly inexpert opinion, a great exploration of how immortality, superpowers and great wealth could absolutely help with that, but still couldn't fully compensate for the systemic issues in a system designed to exploit and repress him. This makes it all the more surprising to me that they apparently decided to drop that aspect of the show almost completely in part 2.
Our skin did not attract the same attention it did in America.
Right, because there wasn't any racism in mid-20th century France.
Oh, I didn't say that. I was just grateful knowing no one wanted to lynch me or direct me to the far end of the cafe counter.
Daniel's incredulousness is presumably the show's attempt to lampshade the issue, but yeah, after that line, Louis' race plays a considerably reduced part of the story, concentrating more exclusively on the high-stakes interpersonal drama of life with the Coven and the unfolding mystery of Armand's machinations. It was interesting to see Louis and Claudia dealing with poverty on their arrival in Paris. Book Louis had just a ludicrous amount of money. He had large Louisiana slave plantation owner levels of money. The possibility of a lack of funds just never comes up in the book. Lestat had no obvious connection to to the Paris Théâtre des Vampires originally, and they certainly didn't have his painting on the wall. Once again, I think the writers tried to use Daniel as a way to lampshade the slightly silly direction they were taking the writing in places.
And one looked up at the painting and saw that Teresa's dead husband was Roberto. He had eloped with his enemy's widow. It's a telenovela. I mean, come on. Lestat's painting on the wall. Are you kidding me?
Not content to just expose Claudia and Madeleine to the sun like in the novel, the show's coven apparently stole a giant focusing lens from a telescope and used it to blast daylight on them. Although I have a theory that this was something added later, as the lens was only ever referenced in the voiceover and never seen on screen. I suspect they realized they'd made the sunlight effect too laser beamy looking and needed to come up with a quick explanation in post. Vampires managing to remain a secret in a modern, terminally online society, a plot hole in many a recent urban fantasy and not an issue for the novel set in the 1970s, is addressed here, though I'm not 100% persuaded by the answer.
Your cell phones make you slaves to your fetishes. You're at the height of willful ignorance. We exploit it.
Several changes stood out to me for not just being a different direction to the book, but the ideological opposite of the original. The Coven wanting Claudia, but not Louis for one. Vampires tended not to want anything to do with Claudia in the book on account of her being an abomination according to their laws. Louis trying to convince Armand to turn Madeleine for them by tempting him with the idea of having him all to himself without Claudia in tow, and Armand not being swayed by this argument is kind of hilarious when you consider that Armand's desperation for exactly that is what led to Claudia's death in the book. The Telemasca, the shadowy organization of mostly humans that monitor vampire activity, didn't feature in this book, but they do exist in the Chronicles as a whole, so I guess it's up to interpretation if that counts as a major change or not. Same with Daniel becoming a vampire at the end. It happened eventually, so I guess there's no harm in it happening now. Lestat's physical role in the book was pretty minimal in the second half, only making a seconds-long appearance in Paris during Claudia's death and when Louis finds him wallowing in his weakened state right at the end. However, his influence over Louis remains strong throughout, as he often thought about him, so keeping Sam Reed involved in the production by making Louis hallucinate Lestat's ghost isn't an insane adaptation choice. He appears to be fully recovered from his near-death experience by the time he's called upon to give testimony against Claudia, his invalid state at the end appearing to be debilitating guilt over what he helped do to her as opposed to something physical. Having been burnt to a crisp right after struggling back to life from his throat cutting in the book, he didn't fully regain his vampire strength until he took his decades-long dirt nap, not awakening until he heard the sounds of heavy metal music. Speaking of which, so what the fuck is Akasha's name doing in Lestat's mouth in 1949? For those of you not familiar with the Queen of the Damned, Akasha was one of the first ever vampires, and she spent millennia as a statue until Lestat's rock music woke her up in the mid-1980s and she tried to take over the world and shit. In the process, she exchanges blood with Lestat and gives him a massive power-up, granting him the ability to fly like Superman and amplifying his psychic powers immensely. However, Lestat eventually turns on her and helps save the world. It's no big deal. But apparently her return and Lestat's preceding 100-year nap underground have already happened by the time of the TV show in the early 20th century. This is confusing. The implications for subsequent adaptations of the Vampire Chronicles cannot be overstated. I have literally no idea how any of this is supposed to work now. I shall be awaiting the release of Season 3 with much anticipation. Final thoughts. So, yeah, despite my attempts to drag this out, it's pretty clear that Season 2 follows a similar path as its predecessor. It is not a faithful adaptation by any definition of the word, but it is, for the most part, clearly made by people who understand and respect the source material, even if they're not trying to recreate it exactly. That said, there are a few things I would like to mention. Firstly, the core of the story is inescapably no longer about the grief and depression that Anne Rice poured straight out of her heart into the novel. It's a tricky one because not being sad as hell is definitely out of keeping with Interview with the Vampire, but It's not wild for the Vampire Chronicles as a whole. By the time the Vampire Lestat was published, Rice had had 9 years to process her grief, and as a result, a little bit of joy was allowed to creep into the story. Keep in mind that Lestat became the lead, so it was a narcissistic, manic joy, but still. I think we can all agree that Season 2 was primarily about different types of abusive relationships, right? Lestat, Armand, Santiago, they all embody different types of toxicity in different levels of overt and insidious. And fittingly for that, the conclusion was Louis coming into his own power at the end as a strong, independent vampire who don't need no man to define who he is. The second thing is, and I know I'm kind of repeating myself from the last episode, but it's mildly disappointing that these show's vampires are no longer unknowable, ungodly things wearing human shapes. They're emotionally relatable now, they're psychologically diagnosable. So yes, my main complaint remains that they shifted the focus to a more human-like emotional and romantic drama. I can't deny it makes for good TV, but it strips a certain amount of the original message away in the process and removes the otherworldliness of Anne Rice's vampires, the almost ineffable something that made them other, making it simpler and more accessible to a wider audience. I've always thought that Anne Rice's vampires were iconic because they weren't just people with fangs, they were aliens, metaphorically at first and then more literally later, but let's not complicate matters. They're a predatory metaphysical consciousness that doesn't fit cleanly into any human moral framework, sexuality, or emotions. These guys? They love, they fuck, they fight, they weep, they heal, they grow. It's a lot of fun to watch, and I still insist that this gothic soap opera was earnestly made for fans of the book, but they're just not the vampires that reawakened people's obsession for the species in 1976.
Speaking of things not being quite as you remember them, Maggie Mayfish's new series on Nebula, Amy's Dead-End Dreamhouse, recreates the earnest tone and aesthetic of the children's TV shows we knew and loved, but with an extremely adult sense of humour that certainly wasn't there before. In her brightly coloured dream house, surrounded by talking appliances, Amy deals with the struggles of unemployment, depression, and society's impossible beauty standards. It's a surprisingly heartfelt and meaningful examination of the expectations of childhood versus the harsh realities of adulthood and the pitfalls that come with it, with a string of guest stars including Katya, Percy Rustomji, Ifyu Wadiwe, Jamie Loftus, and Paul F. Tompkins. Nebula is a creator-built prestige streaming service with an ever-expanding archive of original and exclusive content, including the entire first season of Amy's Dead-End Dreamhouse and a few episodes of Lost in Adaptation that aren't available on YouTube for various reasons. And you could be watching all of this and more right now at a fabulous discount at go.nebula.tv/Dominic Noble, QR code on the screen and link in description. Nebula is currently 50% off annual subscriptions, making it just $30 a year, which is $2.50 a month? That's nothing! Nebula is also currently offering a lifetime subscription for just $300. With this option, you would have access to Nebula and everything on it for as long as you and the website live. You'd never have to pay another penny. And if you don't want to mess around with silly American money, subscriptions are also available in good old-fashioned British pounds and euros. So yeah, go.nebula.tv/Dominic Noble or scan that sexy QR code to check out these videos now and thank me later.